Hi there. Today's story is The Real St. Patrick, and it's from the book The Real St. Patrick by J.M. Holmes. So, Patrick was a Briton. He was brought up in the latter days of the Roman occupation. Few appreciate the fact that he is the only native Briton of that era that we really know anything about. To give a date for his birth is impossible, but it was probably near the end of the 4th century. 390 AD has been suggested. Records of those days are scant, but there's reason to believe that the Christian faith had spread widely in Britain, and Patrick certainly came under its influence. He was of an aristocratic, prosperous, and religious family. His father, Calpurnius, in addition to being a deacon in the church, held an official position associated with the Roman administration and owned a villa and estate near to a village called Banavim Tabernae. The location of that village has never been established, but almost certainly it lay near the west coast of Britain. Patrick's native tongue was an old Celtic language of which the present-day Welsh is a modified form, but being among the privileged classes, he would also have been familiar with Latin. He has given us few details of his childhood and early teens, but does suggest that with regard to Christian influences, he was rebellious and had turned his back on God. One fateful day, a party of fierce Irish raiders descended on the estate. Some of the servants were murdered, and 16-year-old Patrick, along with many others, was overpowered, dragged to the boats, and shipped across the sea to a life of slavery in Ireland. It was a frightening, traumatic experience, the memory of which remained with him for the rest of his life. As they headed home, the pagan raiders were not to know, as we know, that their brutal activities that day would change the history of their island, nor that 16 centuries later, the name of one of the captives huddled in the bottom of the vessel would be a household word, better known than that of St. Augustine or any of the emperors of Rome. The treatment of those captured for the slave market would have been anything but humane. Patrick recalls that he experienced hunger, nakedness, and being near to the point of collapse. He was sold and eventually found himself working for a sheep farmer, where conditions, initially at least, may not have been much better. Whatever religion he had was of the nominal sort, but now his hopeless and desperate plight moved him to earnestly seek for God. Alone in Ireland with no help but the Holy Spirit and his memory of the gospel, he was enduringly converted. To describe such a very personal experience, this is some of his own words on the subject. Up to that time, he confessed, I did not know the true God, but lay in death and unbelief, and took no thought for my salvation. Then he said, the Lord opened the understanding of my unbelieving heart, that I might recall my sins, and turn with all my heart to the Lord my God. The reality of that experience was woven into the remainder of his life. Near the end of his career, casting an eye back, he could say that from that time on, the love of God and the fear of him have grown in me, and up to this day, by the favour of God, I have kept the faith. He never lost a sense of thankfulness to the Lord for what he often referred to as the gift of God. Interestingly, he never showed any bitterness towards the Lord with regard to his capture and subsequent slavery in Ireland, believing, as he did, that the Almighty had permitted this disaster to bring him to trust in Christ. As his faith began to grow, one immediate result for this newborn believer was an urge to pray. He records that he lifted his heart to God while at his work, out in the woods or on the mountainside as many as 100 times a day. He would rise before dawn for prayer in snow and frost and rain and felt no ill effect. Again, looking back, he attributes his health and energy at that time to the fact that the Spirit was glowing in him. What days those must have been! He had had an encounter with the one who was sent to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and to release the oppressed. Patrick was still a slave to men, but his soul was free in God. In the days immediately following his conversion, no divine deliverer arrived to restore Patrick to his friends, but after 6 years in captivity, a voice in a dream one night told him that he would soon return to his own country, and again shortly after that a ship was ready for him. These were the first of a number of similar revelations he tells us about, each of which appeared to mark a turning point or crisis experience in his career. A slave on the run would have been exposed to considerable dangers and hardship, but Patrick gives us few details, saying only that he journeyed without fear and that the Lord guided him. He found a ship ready to sail, but his request for passage was vigorously rejected. However, as he turned away, praying as he walked, the men changed their mind. Soon he was saying farewell to Ireland. It has been debated as to whether the pagan sailors were traders or raiders, but in any case, there is evidence that they soon came to respect their visitor's bold witness for his faith and his confident prayers to God. After 3 days at sea, some daunting hazards were encountered when they landed, but eventually Patrick made it back to his parents and relatives in Britain. He had been torn ruthlessly away from the security of home and the care and love of his family. For 6 years, he was denied all those things which we would regard as vital for any real quality of life. But speaking of that period, he could later testify that the Lord guarded him and comforted him as would a father his son. Those years spent in communion with God and in isolation from friends gave Patrick a preparation for his future work that no theological seminary could match. Even as a slave, his manner of living made a profound impression on those who knew him. And it's reasonable to assume that during that time he had the opportunity to learn the Irish language and gain a knowledge of Irish culture. But now all that was behind him. He was free. As his friends and loved ones rejoiced with him, it takes little effort to imagine his relief and satisfaction. Soon, though, he was to learn that his association with Ireland had not ended, it was only beginning. One night he had a vision in which he saw a man called Victoricus coming to him with a great number of letters. He read the title of one which said, "The Cry of the Irish," and at that moment he seemed to hear the voice of the people who live by the wood of Vauclot, which is by the Western Sea. Unitedly they said, "Holy youth, we are asking you to come and walk among us again." Patrick was so moved that he could read no more. A return to Ireland was hardly in his plans, but this changed everything. It would seem there was born in his heart a burden to bring the gospel to that nation from which he says pointedly, "I was only just able to escape." Of interest is the mention of the wood of Vauclot, the only Irish place name found in any of his writings. This area has been fairly positively identified as being in the northern part of County Mayo, not far from the present-day town of Killala. The fact that those who lived there are pictured as remembering Patrick's godly life and pleading that he would walk again among them suggests very strongly that Ireland's patron saint spent the years of his captivity near the west coast of the island and not at Slemish in County Antrim. A westerly location would also explain why he had to travel 200 miles to get a ship sailing for Britain. He does mention being subjected to other shorter periods of captivity and slavery during his mission. It's not impossible that one of these periods was spent in the Slemish area, thus giving rise to the popular tradition. Patrick's call was soon confirmed in other ways, but now some years of preparation were required. He became a deacon in the local church and eventually was appointed a bishop. Typically, he remarks, "I was not worthy. Some friends pleaded with tears and offered gifts to persuade him to call off his mission to Ireland, but he refused to be moved. Again, typically, he says, no thanks to me, it was God who prevailed in me." Motivated by the love of Christ, he believed that the gift he had already received of knowing and loving God was on condition that he leave for good his own country and kinsfolk. Ireland in ancient times was regarded by the Roman world as the ends of the earth. It was inhabited mainly by barbaric tribespeople, many of whom were of Celtic origin. They spoke in a tongue out of which has grown the present-day Irish language. Though regarded as a primitive nation, the Irish were acknowledged as being competent sailors and were quite capable of piratical raids on Britain like the one described earlier. No towns had been built, no structured form of central government existed. The tribal unit, the Tua, was in reality a small kingdom, consisting mainly of the extended family. The remains of ring forts, which mark sites of population, can still be seen in many places. The buildings themselves, not being constructed of enduring materials, have long since disappeared. Much of the country in the early 5th century was covered by forest. There were no proper roads. Some areas were desolate, inaccessible, and hostile to aliens. This was the land to which Patrick returned as a missionary bishop somewhere around the year 435 AD. He had with him his Latin Bible, some form of financial support, the backing of a few Christians, and, humanly speaking, very little else. Although always maintaining a Roman identity, he determined never to leave Ireland. It became his adopted country, and for some 30 years he spread a simple gospel far and wide, reaching even the tribes in the isolated places. He never claimed to be the first Christian to come to the island. There is reasonable evidence to suggest that Christianity first took root in southern parts and that Patrick worked mainly in the north. One thing is certain, he never regarded himself as other than a pioneer evangelist. He did not build on another's foundation. That he came at all was a marvel even to himself. Who compelled me, he asks, and then gives the credit to the Spirit of God. It was not my doing, this holy compassion that I have towards that nation, which once took me captive and dealt havoc among the men and women servants of my father's house. There's plenty of evidence that he taught the doctrine of the Trinity, but did he use the shamrock to do so? It's possible, but doubtful. He had none of the trappings of modern evangelism, and the roof of his meeting house was the sky above. Even the distribution of literature would have been pointless, for the tribespeople could not read. It was left to them to judge the truth of the message by what they heard and by the character of the preacher. Patrick knew nothing of the great American continents, so in the process of time, when he looked across the waters of the Atlantic, he believed that Christ's commission to go into all the world had been carried out. He had preached the gospel as far as the point where there is no one beyond. His Irish converts were never far from his heart. He rejoiced as he saw them in the fulfillment of the word of Jesus, who predicted that many would come from the east and from the west. Thank you. Bye-bye.